A.L. Morton was one of the most influential historians of apocalyptic and millenarian movements, though today his name is often forgotten in scholarship. Morton was born near Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk in 1903, and he retained a lifelong interest in local and rural history, including digging out details on religious figures from 17th century Suffolk. But whatever local interests he had, they were part of a bigger understanding of English history. Morton was a dedicated Marxist, and for most of his life a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. This meant that Morton wanted to explain how English history transformed from different modes of production into new ones, including the rise and fall of medieval feudalism, the emergence of capitalism, and the transformation of capitalism into socialism. Morton took seriously the idea that radical and non-orthodox religious beliefs were part of this process, and saw religious ideas as both reactionary and progressive, sometimes too progressive. When he wrote his most famous book in 1938, A People's History of England, he argued that some of the more millenarian movements of the 17th century English Revolution and their demands involved democratic and communistic thinking to such an extent that they were too ahead of their time and doomed to fail. At this point in his career, Morton believed that radical movements in English history were more effective when they tempered expectations, so that they might be more effective in challenging reactionary structures of society and unleashing progressive ideas in the long run. This was partly because Morton was influenced by standard socialist and communist thinking of the late 1930s, namely that the threat of fascism had to be met by a broad, popular and political alliance, and so Morton looked to equivalent examples in English history. After the war, Morton was a founding member of the Communist Party Historians Group, which was crucial for, among other things, developing our understanding of the history of apocalyptic and millenarian movements. Some of the most famous post-war historians were members of this group, including Christopher Hill, Eric Hobsbawm, Dorothy Thompson, and E.P. Thompson. One of the arguments the historians group made was that apocalypticism and millenarianism was a largely fantastical pre-modern phenomenon, such as an expression of peasant discontent, but that it was absorbed and transformed by socialist and communist parties in the present. And it was Morton who was producing such arguments in the war and early post-war years. Whereas someone like Norman Cohen represented what we might call a liberal tradition of understanding apocalypticism, and by that I mean he argued that the precursors of communism and fascism were to be found in medieval peasant uprisings and peasant revolutionary movements that irrationally fed into modern political ideologies that Cohen didn't like. A.L. Morton represented a Marxist reading of this tradition. He too thought that pre-modern apocalyptic movements and apocalypticism fed into socialism and communism, but he saw this as a good thing, an important thing, and he saw that these pre-modern movements were updated and transformed and secularized into socialist and communist movements in the 20th century. Morton and his colleagues also rethought the idea of radical millenarian movements in English history. Morton became less critical and saw them as politically progressive, raising egalitarian and democratic ideas that could now be taken up by the working class in the 20th century. In some ways, this was a reflection of the early post-war years and a response to the frustration Morton and others felt towards the conservatism of politics at the time, including what they saw as the failures of the Labour Party to keep their promises about bringing about socialism. But Morton also recognised that the religious ideas of historic millenarian movements could be quite different to modern secular ideas. One theory he developed, related again to the English Revolution, was that certain millenarian and antinomian figures emphatically turned to expectations of the end times and spectacular divine intervention to compensate for the failure of political transformation on Earth, or at least in England. Nevertheless, Morton saw that the hope for a new and transformed England was a thread running throughout English history, at least since the medieval period. In 1950, Morton moved here to Clare, in Suffolk, and it was the perfect setting really for his 1952 book, The English Utopia. The English Utopia represents a significant development in the Communist Party Historians Group, where they've now begun to look at the radical implications of English socialist history, English religious history, English apocalyptic history, and try to connect that past with the militant present. Morton continued to work on English utopianism and radical religious history for the rest of his life. He also worked on secularized expressions of the utopian hopes, what he saw as the socialist and communist transformation of such ideas, including the delay in the Great Transformation of England. Here he turned to the 19th century designer, socialist and writer William Morris. One of the reasons why Morris was important here was because he provided Morton with an explanation about the delays and difficulties in bringing about socialism. As a younger man, Morton expected socialism to come about in his lifetime. In his latter years, he started to realise this was not happening imminently and used Morris to warn others of the struggles that still lay ahead, and would lay ahead after Morton died.
We're here at Clare Parish Cemetery, where we've been looking for Morton's grave, and we eventually found it. Morton died on the 23rd of October 1987. He was finishing off a pamphlet on 1688 and the so-called Glorious Revolution. And he was buried here in what was described as a simple service. 3 years later his wife died and she joined him. Next to Morton is Tommy Jackson's grave, his father-in-law, Vivian's father.
Today, Morton's legacy in apocalyptic and millenarian studies may be forgotten, but it's still pervasive, particularly the claims of the progressive potential in apocalypticism, though unlike many modern commentators, Morton was always clear that there were contradictions with reactionary tendencies. It is time his reputation and influence were uncovered and brought to the fore in scholarship.